on?
No, they turn them on themselves when they see you speaking. All right. Are we roughly ready? Is Frank on the line? Not yet, no. Well, we'll give him a minute. And if not, we will start and catch up with him later. Okay. Can somebody close the door at the end? I suggest that if he's not on the line, we start. Okay. Can you give me a sign? Is it that he's not there or we are not able to connect?
He's just having a few issues connecting with my
Sorry?
He's having a few issues connecting with my ears. He's on the phone. We're just trying.
Okay. Is a connection problem? Okay, well, let's start anyway, because lots of you are here. We have a huge roundtable, I should say, more than a panel. This is now into real big roundtable territory. And I'm delighted to continue the conversation that we had. Of course, as you know, this morning we've all majored on Europe and economic issues confronting Europe. We have shifted into another territory. The rest of the afternoon is going to be focusing very much on our digital reality. I wanted to start with Frank, but I will postpone. He's not quite online yet. Maybe we have Frank after all. But we'll give him maybe a second to settle down. I would have gone on from Frank to talk to Jacob. Jacob is an academic, and he has founded and runs an outfit, a think tank called Freedom of Speech. And I think it is important in framing the discussion we're going to have in this roundtable for us Europeans to really understand what is so fundamental in driving for Americans when they talk about First Amendment and freedom of speech. We have a vision of that which is not quite capturing what Americans really understand for it, what they pursue with it, what they believe is a fundamental constitutional principle. And so I think that we can, to borrow a phrase from the previous panel, we can in Europe sit around and talk about democracy, but if we don't understand why First Amendment and freedom of speech are so foundational for Americans. I spent a lot of time in Texas, and a lot of that is a discussion that I hear all the time. We are missing the understanding of much that is before us. So please, Jacob, why don't you just give us a sense for why that, what does it mean and why is it so important and why is it used to support the shift that we're seeing now in the way the platforms are using content moderation or algorithmic amplification?
Yeah, so I should say I'm a Dane living in Tennessee, so I'm not an American. So any Americans who think that I'm libeling or misrepresenting the U.S. position, I'm a strong believer in free speech, so feel free to call me out. So my sense is, and I'll come back to why the relationship with the U.S., my sense is that Europe is gripped by a sense of being beset on all sides by populist forces that undermine democracy, amplified by US tech platforms that weaponize free speech against democracy. I think a strong example of that was the reactions to Mark Zuckerberg's announcements about the policy changes on Meta platforms to essentially tamp down hate speech regulations and replace third-party fact checkers in the US. And the reaction that I saw was one saying that now Meta will essentially be platforming racism, extremism, and disinformation and launch a war on democracy. And I think there are good reasons to be wary of big tech, especially some of the business models that these platforms operate on and some of the harms that they can cause to the social fabric. But I also think, and I think this is something shared by a lot of Americans, that the European approach to speech regulation is one that is very much based on harms, on compliance, and on regulation that is a cure worse than the disease in many ways, and one that is likely to contribute to or roll back some important gains, historical gains. And to give some historical example, so this year is the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, which is, I think, a landmark achievement of transatlantic cooperation, where free speech and technology was actually used to undermine the rule in the Soviet bloc, empower dissidents. An iconic moment was when Havel stood before the US Congress and said, 2 months ago I was in prison, now I stand before you as a president of a country with full democracy. So at that time, there was this belief among democracies that free speech and technology was a competitive advantage for open societies against authoritarian states. And it's a key driver in the third wave of democratization that saw democracy and freedom spread to other countries around the world. Now, the vibe shift that I see in Europe especially is that free speech has become a threat to democracy. Now it is being seen as sort of a Trojan horse being used by authoritarians, especially in the digital space. And this leads me back to Zuckerberg's comments. And now you can be very cynical about it because the timing, the toning, the framing of it was very obviously carefully curated to play nice with the new administration, to cater to the sort of cultural vibe shift in the US. But it also resonated a American, I think, sense of a civil libertarian understanding of free speech, and one in which there's a sense that regulation coming out of the EU, other countries have pushed back way too much against sort of the ethos that Silicon Valley was based upon. And I think that there's actually data to back this up. So my organization, we did a study of the hate speech policies of the 8 major social media platforms from their first iteration until today. What we see is that those speech restrictions have grown over time, become more and more restrictive to the point where they're much more restrictive, for instance, than under international human rights norms, even though most of these platforms have signed up and say, hey, we respect international human rights norms. We've also looked at the nature of deleted comments. So we've looked at deleted comments on Facebook and YouTube in Denmark, France, Sweden, and Germany. The vast majority of deleted comments, 90 to 98%, are perfectly lawful. Many of them, half of them, are not even controversial. So that plays into what a lot of Americans say. Well, this kind of speech regulation, well, whether it's sort of the NetzDG as the first model, the code of conduct, the DSA, incentivizes platforms to remove a lot of content that is perfectly legal and that silences voices of people around the world. So that's, I think, one of the American frustrations about this. When it comes to disinformation, another point, I actually think that the crowdsourced fact-checking that is being proposed is a positive step. I mean, it's one of the only things that actually work on X is crowdsourced fact-checking. It's actually something that where we have quite a bit of research to show that this is a model that has the capability of working and that takes power away from the platforms and gives it back to users and is also capable of increasing trust. And we've seen in a country like Taiwan, for instance, that it's actually capable of scaling and also being able to counter virality, in this case of Chinese disinformation. Now, I think the real danger of US tech platforms when it comes to free speech specifically, and then we can talk about antitrust and all these things that are not my focus area, but the real danger is whether these platforms now become co-opted by the new administration. So are they going to change their policies, their speech policies, in ways that reflect the grievances of the Trump administration, basically saying, okay, we're now going to clamp down on wokeism, or we're not going to allow you to call Trump an election denier. That, I think, would be a huge danger. And this is where I think the US has a competitive advantage against the US, because the First Amendment is a much stronger protection against government regulation of political speech. Now, it's not a foolproof because obviously, you know, the platforms can do so out of their own free will. So it's not a guarantee against that. But in that sense, the American speech regulation provides a stronger brakes on that than does European regulation. Ultimately, I think in terms of solutions, it's not realistic or desirable from a European point of view to adopt a US speech regulation model. But I think we have to look at more creative solutions. So I think it's solutions where users are empowered to make many more decisions about the type of content that they want to be confronted with, where they can curate their feeds to a much higher extent so that we get around the dangers of corporate centralization, but also the danger of well-intentioned regulation from governments that impinge on free speech. And this is one of the models of Blue Sky that has grown significantly, and I think there's a lot of interesting work going on now to sort of develop social media models that are more pro-social, that don't optimize for engagement. I think that's a much more promising way to navigate this than the current sort of alarmist tendencies in Europe.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I can see, I'll return to your points, which I think were very clear and useful. I would like to, now that I see him on screen, apologize to Frank for having started without him. I am sorry, Frank, but there is pressure on time, so there was uncertainty and apologies for the connection not working initially. I had intended to start from you because for those who don't know Frank, he's of course a businessman, but also a major philanthropist. He has set up a major initiative called Project Liberty, and he has convened multiple gatherings under that umbrella, including one fairly recently in DC, which collected a huge amount of people from the philanthropy world to the academic world to many others. He's a very generous donor to a lot of academic institutions. He's also involved in one of the consortia, or leading the consortium, one of the consortium with making a bid for TikTok. So let me start, Frank, with giving you the floor, and maybe you can. This is an audience in Europe that isn't necessarily familiar with Project Liberty, although many of us know what it's about. But what are you seeking to achieve? What's the solution you're trying to put forward? What motivated you? What's the goal? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Cristina, and let me start by just thanking you for hosting this and for your participation in Project Liberty. Hello to my fellow panelists, some of whom I know, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and to the audience. Yeah, we started Project Liberty 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago now, December of 19, to address the fundamental problems with our internet technology infrastructure. I should add that we had started focusing on the policy-making apparatus as our first step, and helped start a public policy school in Washington, D.C. with Georgetown 5 years prior to that, in 2013. It's a great public policy school, but sadly, we learned that our policymaking apparatus in the United States, and I think you found the same in Europe, is no match for the speed, the power, the wealth, the agility, the influence of big tech. So that's why we started Project Liberty in end of 2019, was to address the technology itself. We have a systemic problem here. And as an infrastructure builder, and coming from a family of 5 generations of infrastructure builders, I went back to my roots and really focused deeply on how the internet works, and seeing if there was an intervention to fundamentally change how it works, to put people first. The head of our labs group, Braxton Woodham, came forward with what I thought was a very keen insight, and that was, look, we have a core protocol that connects devices, TCP/IP. We have another core protocol that connects data, HTTP. Why not yet another core protocol, open source, owned by everyone, that connects us. It just seems to me to be well past time that we all are still a device on the internet. We need to be a human being on the internet in charge of our identity, our data, our relationships, and permission the use of our data. I think until we fix the core technology, we will be spending all of our time and energy to exhaustion, all of our financial resources until they're depleted, chasing the symptoms, the problems that are caused by current internet technology, social media being the poster child. Surveillance-based, centralized, autocratic technology, which is how the internet operates right now, and how these big apps on the internet operate right now, these big platforms, is utterly incompatible with democratic principles and the human rights that we all prioritize and believe it's our job to protect. If I were to ask any of you to describe democracy, I doubt you would say surveillance-based, centralized, autocratic, exploitive, and so forth. And that's what we have with our internet technology right now. And it turns out it's much more resilient than democracy, much more powerful, and quite agnostic about human rights and democratic principles and ideals. So until we address the core problem and put each of us in charge of what is ours, and when I say what is ours, I mean everything about us in the digital age is digitized, right? We are our data is scraped, aggregated, where each micro profile, and then those profiles are used to actually, sure, they're used to sell us things, a good or a service, but they're also used now to feed us news that we're inclined to believe in because it meets our bias. It's also it triggers us, manipulates us, because it's assessed our personality, and now the technology is this out of control, very exploitive technology. When we're sold innovation, but it's really exploitation, I think we're at a very difficult moment. Jack Dorsey, who started Twitter, said in Oslo in June of last year, we're talking far too much about the loss of free speech and too little about the loss of free will. These platforms are highly manipulative, and we see now the harms. And this, whether we're talking about social media or large language models, OpenAI or DeepSeek, it's all the same thing. It's information that individuals should be, or companies or publications or so on and so forth, should be permissioning the use of the data and understanding how it's being used with transparency, being able to rescind permission. And by the way, individuals who are participating, and it turns out our data is hugely valuable, should be gaining value and receiving value for that. So there is technology available now that allows identity to be prioritized, allows one to own and control their data, and relationships, by the way, if you're someone who's building an audience or a customer base. And it's time we actually adopt this new technology. The internet, after all, was created to solve for a centralized telecommunications problem that the United States had. Our telecom was very centralized. There was a fear that a centralized hubs could be attacked and disabled. And so the government provided funding for universities to come up with a decentralized communication system, which became the internet that we all use now. and we're all dependent on. The internet has become highly centralized, and we need to re-decentralize it so that individuals have agency returned to them. The power dynamic needs to shift from these platforms to individuals, because we don't need a digital Bill of Rights. We need technology that harmonizes with, in the US, the Bill of Rights we already have. In Europe, I dare say that although you're far ahead of the US when it comes to your policy intentions, there's not technology to implement those intentions. So the policy, the regulators will just be chasing the problem. And of course, the tech platforms move much faster than regulators or regulations. So I think we're at the point where we need to recognize that this is just engineering, it's just technology, and we need to address it at the core, put individuals in charge. It's our data. We want to be citizens in the digital age, not reverted to subjects in the digital age. And by the way, this Project Liberty has invested $500 million in creating this new tech stack. It's up and operating. There are over 1.5 million people using it now, so we're well beyond the proof of concept. What it lacks is scale. We need an alternative internet, or nobody's leaving the one we have, and the damages and the harms will continue. The reason we launched the bid for TikTok, US TikTok, was to acquire the user base and the data, migrate that user base and data over to this new stack, and then with 170 million users, we have spun up an alternative internet that people can choose to use, where they're in charge of themselves. They get value for their data. They permission to choose. Why not an internet where each of us is no longer clicking on the terms and conditions of use of a very few big platforms, but the new apps are clicking on our terms and conditions of use for our data? Why not an internet where we control our identity? Why not an internet where our data is portable? Why not an internet where the apps are interoperable? It's all very doable, and I just feel, I'm just hoping more harm doesn't have to be done before we all realize that we're barking up the wrong tree.
Thank you, and thank you so much also for really emphasizing the importance of infrastructure creation, not just dealing with the manifestation. I say just, it's an objective in itself, but we spend a lot of time on regulation that deals with the manifestation of this power, but to create alternative structure is super important. You want to say a bit more? I know you are very busy in the midst of the TikTok bid and discussion. You outlined a vision which is briefly to create demand for that would allow scaling. How do you see the current landscape? I realize it's a question about what is the current prospect in some dimension. What's going to happen? There's a lot of confusion about what might happen to TikTok. Is there a prospect that a sale may be achieved? How do you see it?
Well, I think it's unclear. The legislation is clear that any sale would have to involve a complete 100% disentanglement from the Chinese technology. Our Supreme Court upheld that 9-0, and you can all read that decision. It's online, and if you just go to pages 5 and 6, you'll see the very specific language around this disentanglement, not only from the algorithm, but also from the data, no co-hosting of data, and so on and so forth. So to solve, if there's going to be a sale, one has to solve for how would you buy the data and the user base and have it work without the Chinese technology and without the algorithm. And that's where Project Liberty is in a very, very unique position, because we have the tech stack to onboard the user base and the data. And by the way, we would not be a bidder if we hadn't been building this alternative stack for the last 5 years. It's only because we've we built this and invested in this, that we coincidentally can solve for the national security issue, and at the same time create the scale that would demonstrate that the internet can work differently, favoring individuals over the platforms. Now, whether ByteDance will sell or not is a separate question. But I, based on my conversations with leadership on both the House and the Senate and both the Republican and Democratic sides, there seems to be a unanimity regarding enforcing the legislation and making sure that if there's a sale, there's a complete disentanglement from the Chinese technology. And I welcome my friends in Europe to join this. There's 130 million people in Europe using TikTok who are whose data is being scraped and who are being surveilled, and the data is being scraped, and it's in the hands of China. And as most people know, ByteDance is controlled by a so-called golden share, which is a share that's controlled by the Ministry of Propaganda and the CCP. So it's a tool not just of surveillance and gathering up information. It's a tool of propaganda. Once you have the information on 130 million people in Europe or 170 million citizens in the United States, you actually have an ability to actually feed information to those individuals. There's well over 50%, approaching 60% now of the 170 million Americans on TikTok are getting their news exclusively or primarily from TikTok, and only 1% of that news, quote unquote, is coming from journalists or reliable media. So it's a very powerful propaganda tool, and the evidence is in now after people have studied what the algorithm favors on TikTok and what it de-amplifies on TikTok, and it's very startling. And I don't know, what else we need to see to wake up to the fact that the design of internet technology is it's off the rails, totally, utterly incompatible with democratic ideals and principles and basic human rights.
This is a wonderful way to end. Let me just stop you there for a moment, and we'll get back to you. But I want to return to the panel. You talked about TikTok as a propaganda instrument. We've seen this in Europe. Of course, the Romanian election, the concerns around the Romanian election and the interference from Russia in the Romanian election around TikTok was a very live issue, led to consequences that we know. And Jacob, just before you laid out what is the obvious question. It's all jolly nice for Americans to talk about freedom of speech and First Amendment, but the potential for this all to be essentially weaponized in support of particular points of view that are problematic is very obvious. So let me turn to Marietje, who, of course, has a well-known book, Tech Coup, which discusses all of this. But take it away.
Okay. Do I need to do anything? I'm hidden behind Cristina. Oh, thank you. Where to begin? This is all about power and the question of who has the legitimacy to decide and to govern over our lives, not over digital technologies or companies, but our lives, because technology is interwoven with every aspect of our life right now. And so, Jacob, I'm afraid that you've kind of gone native in the sense that you look at this issue from the speech perspective, because there's so much more than just speech. But even if you only look at speech, you will see that the CEOs leading these social media companies do not even respect freedom of expression because they sue civil society organizations that use their freedom of expression to challenge advertisers, for example, when their content is placed next to far-right or otherwise hateful content. There's the data aspect that Frank so articulately talked about, but there is broadly, of course, the whole question of, is it legitimate for companies to curate, based on shareholder interests, our information diet? And essentially, whether you come at this from the US perspective or the European perspective, from Jacob's perspective or from Frank's perspective, it doesn't matter because none of us have the ability to independently verify what these companies are doing because there's a systematic problem of transparency. And so I think that is something that hopefully we can agree on, that there should be a place now that these companies are so powerful to say, look, we're not going to trust, but we want to verify. And we want to be able to understand better how business models that are constantly changing, so we're not talking about static phenomena, but constantly changing and updating experiences for us as users, for us as societies with these tech companies. We want to learn more about it, as academics, as journalists, as civil society organizations, as regulators, as members of parliament, some of whom are here. And so we need to be able to understand. And that would probably require changes to intellectual property protection, something quite controversial, but now that intellectual property protection is, relevant again in the context of AI, perhaps this can be discussed as well. So I hope that we can tackle the problem of the outsized power of tech companies, not just social media, but really many of them, and the threat that they pose to democracy in capturing and pulling ever more decisions towards themselves, taken in the private interest, not in the public interest, without that transparency, without the needed accountability, and develop measures from that perspective. And just a final thought, then I'll stop my answer. Building on the last panel, I really thought that some of the concerns about the US being basically lost as a defender of democracy, a respecter of democracy, as imperfect as it may have been, in many instances. I don't want to glorify the status quo, but the whole giving up of the idea of being part of a coalition of democratic countries that care about protecting democracy at home and abroad, now going to only caring about deals, weaponizing the rules-based order, not respecting rules, going after minorities, going after, previous partners. I don't think we can just say, oh, well, if you want to do business with the US, you just go to the business deals and that's where the action is. It is a deeply depressing moment that Europe is at this alone, but we, meaning the European regulators, European societies, all of us essentially, and its allies in the United States, as Barry so importantly pointed out, are the only game in town that can change the reality of an outsized power in the business community that has now merged with the political anti-democratic power of the Trump administration, and that will have disastrous impact. Whether you look at it from freedom of expression, whether you look at it from other human rights or the rule of law, this is a critical moment that we have to meet, and if it's not Europe, then I don't know who will.
Thank you. Thank you. A sentiment we all share. I want to move on to, I'll get back to this, Marietje, well said. I want to move on to Alexandra, Member of Parliament, who has been very vocal and very engaged in discussing these issues. What can Europe do to actually deal with this? Alexandra, I won't take any more time. Floor is yours.
No, you don't have to.
Perfect. Can she have the mic?
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I would like to contest this idea that there's a cultural difference on free speech between the US and Europe. I come from Germany, and we have a very sophisticated and strict system of media pluralism against power concentration in media, and very clear legislation on freedom of speech, but also about the speech that is prohibited, like Holocaust denial. And you know who imposed that on Germany as a precondition to become a free country again was the Americans, who saved us from the Nazi regime after World War II. You know, that's an American invention. Media pluralism, limitation of market power in media, because they had understood very well what the mass communication did to the German population and how it created consensus for the Nazi regime. And the idea of banning Holocaust denial, I think that can be traced back to the soldiers who freed the victims of concentration camps, to say, we want this never to be forgotten. This is a fact. And we want people in 80, 100 years from now not to think you can have an opinion of that. There are things you can't have an opinion about. They are facts. This is not between America and the US. I think the freedom of speech argument is being weaponized by a few tech billionaires and by the political side profiting, benefiting from that concentration of power and from the algorithmic amplification of their speech. It has nothing to do with real freedom. Meta, just to stay, since Mark Zuckerberg has been very prominent, accusing the European Union of censoring content, which is absolutely untrue. All the examples he gave have to do with the US administration and not with Europeans. Meta censors queer content. Meta censors abortion content. Meta censors content, entertainment programs by German public broadcasters. It's a long-standing fight between German public broadcasters and Meta and Google censor that kind of content. So it's not about freedom of speech as such, as an absolutist principle. It's just about whose freedom of speech, and especially about whose freedom of reach. Because that is another thing, freedom of speech argument. I'm totally in favor of freedom of speech. I know what authoritarian regimes do to freedom of speech, so I'm really not about censoring content without a legal basis to do that. That clearly makes that transparent. But the real problem is here, is the freedom of reach. Who has freedom of reach? Which kind of content is amplified? And we know that. It's borderline content. That is metadata. It's the borderline paradox. So the closer the content comes to the policy line, after which it is or illegal or goes against the terms and conditions of the company itself, the higher the dissemination is. So the more people it reaches and the quicker it spreads. And that is the reason why you say there has been an increasing concern and increasing rules, because there's an increasing problems. You know, if you just leave problematic content in that fringe corner where it usually stay, it's not a problem. You know, if 10% of people have strange convictions, it's fine. That's freedom of speech, that's democracy. But if then 80% of people are confronted with them every second of the day, then you have a problem. That is really what we need to address. It's not the pieces of content, it's the algorithmic amplification. And the algorithmic amplification is the power instrument of the billionaires and now the US tech administration, it's a frugal lapse. But Marietje explained that very well, how this goes together. And this is what needs to be addressed. And this is what Europe really cares about, the way this is amplified. And just one last point on freedom of speech as an absolutist principles. There are people on the receiving sides, and it's not a coincidence that most proponents of this absolutist idea of freedom of speech are men. Because if somebody does not agree with you, Jacob, he will tell, I don't agree. Maybe you will have comments saying you're stupid and this is absolutely untrue and I really disagree. And some things, you know, if I write on X, I don't agree with Elon Musk manipulating the elections in Germany, I get rape threats. That's not the same thing. And this is pushing people out of the public discourse. And there's a lot of data. You know, in Germany, for example, more than half of the population say they don't express their political opinion freely in the internet because they're afraid of hateful speech, of threats, of insults. That is particularly true for young people, for women, for queer people, for people of color, so the majority of the population. And that is the problem with community notes. Because, you know, women in my age who don't have to be on platforms for professional reasons aren't. because they don't like that kind of discourse. People leave. And then the people who stay there, they decide what is correct and what is not correct if you work with community notes as opposed to fact-checking. You know, it's biased. It's just what thinks the kind of population who is still there, who is not affected by the hate. That's not a broad spectrum of population. It's not representative. And the other thing, so that is a limitation of freedom of speech of people who are on the receiving end of hateful speech, very clearly. And also of people who don't enjoy conversations that are not fact-based in any way. People just leave, they just go away. The problem is that the manipulation stays because the whole media look at social media and think those are the facts, and that's the opinion so this gets into the media realm, this gets into politics, and it's enormous power instrument and influence instrument. And this is what we need to stop. But we need to focus on the power concentration, on having more pluralism, and on the algorithmic amplification, making that transparent, and stopping algorithms that disseminate disinformation from 6 to 10 times more than information. No normal person has the time to check every source, to look at everything. You know, normal people work 8 hours a day, commute 2 hours a day, take care of their families 4 or 5 hours a day. They don't want to spend their time on the internet checking sources and is this really true? They want to have a probability of, I don't know, 70, 80% that what they look at are facts, and opinions that are clearly marked as opinions and not as false facts. That makes our life easier, and that makes democracy possible. And the American forefathers, those who came to Germany after World War II and saw the destruction and the misery that that regime had caused, they knew that very well, and they helped us to build a system that respects that. And this is what, you know, what Mark Zuckerberg is now calling censorship.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Alexandra. Great. I want to go to someone who's actually trying to do something about it, Renate at the Commission. But before I do that, I think that Jacob was signaling that maybe he wanted to jump in and say a couple of things.
Yeah, first of all, it's a deep misunderstanding of the American free speech tradition. To a very large extent, the First Amendment's expansion was won by persecuted minorities. So the civil rights movement, for instance, African Americans who would be arrested for peaceful protests in the South won some of the major, most important free speech victories. And some of the decisions, the decision in the United States, which allows even vile racist hate speech, the lawyers who represented that person, one was a Jew and the other was an African American woman, because they understood very well that if you allow the government to decide, then that will be weaponized against minorities. And that has been the history of the United States. So even though the First Amendment is couched in very absolutist terms, you have to go up until the late 50s and early 60s before it really had the teeth. And before that, unpopular minorities were frequently persecuted. Then you say you have clear rules in Germany. Excuse me, your vice chancellor had a person arrested for posting a meme on Twitter calling him an idiot. No, it's not. No, it's
okay.
It is.
But this is a lie, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
You have people who are being arrested, convicted for pro-Palestinian protests, saying from the river to the sea. You have no, it's not a. Of course it's not. It's a political statement. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but it's something that can be weaponized. Yes, in Germany it is, because the government says, we know better than you. This is deeply problematic.
Because we have history in Germany. We have
I've written a book on the history of free speech, including the Weimar Republic. What was Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution? What was that? That was an exception, that was an emergency law, which was used by the Nazis when in power to abolish all civil liberties. So the very protections that were put in place to save democracy were the ones being used to abolish it. Joseph Goebbels was censored frequently. Julius Streicher was put in prison during the Weimar Republic. So this idea of the militant democracy that Germany is so beset on and that Europe is very beset on, rest on quite empirical, shaky grounds. And your sort of caricature of American absolutism is just factually wrong. And also there is no, no one in the US is in favor of free speech absolutism. No one is saying that you should be allowed to make threats or incitement to violence. So that's, yeah.
Okay, so good comeback. We will do that again. I want to go to Renate, who's there smiling serenely in the middle of all this. But of all of us, actually, has the very difficult job of doing something about it. Or really, within the Commission, of course, we know there is in outside, generally, there is a big expectation that, or an invitation that, for example, if the DSA was wielded properly, we could deal with this. But what is this? I mean, of course, the DSA is a great law, but what are we dealing with? Is it a question of election integrity, foreign interference? Is it a question of media concentration? What kind of hammer are we going to be using to hit what nails?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the DSA is an important part of the answer, because with the DSA, we bring a much higher level of accountability of platforms on the table. And I think a lot has been said about what this means. This means, first of all, much more control for the individual to decide what he or she gets, why she gets that, and also to have choices what he or she doesn't want to get. Also, much more transparency, because the big problem about big tech and the algorithmic structure is that, there are black boxes. And I think we need to get much deeper into these black boxes to actually have a full assessment of the effect of engagement-based kind of algorithms and all that. And then also, because, what the DSA does, building on what has been said on freedom of speech, is that it's not a content law. It's agnostic to content. It is about empowering the individual. It is about kind of giving the national authorities following the national criminal law, and that is as was clearly explained, in the European Union that might differ from one country to the other. What is seen as an illegal behavior and as illegal hate speech, for instance, give them the possibility to order the platforms to kind of, act on it. But there is no obligation whatsoever in the DSA to take down content. It's a kind of a notice and action system, and it's a system that is driven by national authorities on the basis of orders that have, of course, been checked nationally. For the rest, that's where we come in as the digital regulator. The DSA is a risk-based approach. It looks at, in particular, for the very large online platforms, so those who have at least 45 million users per month in the EU, at the systemic risks that they might present. And they are very broad. They go from civic discourse to violence against women, minor protection online, mental health, and you name it. And what we have established with the Digital Services Act is a constant kind of pressure on the very large online platforms to kind of give us regularly risk assessments and to show to us how to mitigate these risks. Again, there is no obligation to do this one way or another. That's again for the platforms. There might be community notes, there might be fact checking. What is important for us as digital regulator is to kind of have the possibility to assess whether that is effective. And a lot has already been happening in that young, age of the DSA implementation. It's only been there for 1.5 years. We're also not in this alone. We are acting from the European Commission, of course, in concert with the national digital service coordinators, and they have just come on board a year ago. It's February, we will celebrate the first anniversary of that. So I think this is an important tool, and we have shown with our enforcement actions that we have rolled out over the last year that we really mean it, and we want to enforce it. When, however, we are talking about the bigger kind of themes of democracy, I think we have to put in a couple of other aspects. For instance, on election integrity, something that has been at the heart of our work on the DSA ever since we started enforcing it, not the least because we had European Parliament elections upcoming, and we have elections in a lot of the member states. We had several of them already. So here what we're doing actually is bringing different elements to play. Before the Digital Services Act, we had in Europe an experience of several years of self-regulatory code of conducts. We had a code of conduct on illegal hate speech since 2016 that we have just converted under the Digital Services Act because that's foreseen. These systems can become co-regulatory systems under the DSA. We just did that last Monday, not this week, the week before, and we have all the signatories, including X, Meta, they are all with us on this. And we had since 2018 a code of practice on disinformation. And we bring these kind of systems, and these are codes where the signatories are not only the platforms, it's also civil society, it's fact-checking organization, it's academic institutions, and that ecosystem has proven very useful to engage, especially when you have a moment such as an election, into a really close cooperation. For instance, they have decided in the Code of Practice Against Disinformation to establish a rapid response system. That means a very, very rigid monitoring system where you can actually monitor the developments, very, very regularly, and you act fast so that you can respond fast. Because in the kind of midst of an election campaign, in the weeks before, on day of election, around the election, you have to be really aware of the potential risks, and you need to kind of be ready to act. And we have established with the national regulators on their request, because we can't impose that. It's not our competence in the EU to organize national elections. But we exercise that for the European Parliament elections, and we are doing it now if there is a willingness, and there is a willingness by national regulators to work with them. We're organizing roundtables. We just had one in Berlin last Friday. Bring everybody around the table. So that means the platforms, civil society, of course us, the national regulator, but also all the authorities who have a role to play here for the individual orders when there is really something happening on the spot that needs to be acted upon individually, because we cannot come on the individual kind of, tweets or whatever. We come in when there's a systemic risk. So in the heat of the moment, there has to be that kind of coordination structure ready. And they were all there. All the platforms were around the table, which is, I think, a good thing in itself. And we will come together later this week to do a stress test and to run together through potential scenarios that could go wrong. Because, and here let me bring in another dimension, in Europe, we are faced with foreign interference. We are talking about, when there is a case, we attribute sometimes, disinformation waves to third states, only when there is evidence. But we had, for instance, in Germany, the doppelganger kind of, situation that was clearly attributed to Russia. So I think we have to, if we really want to address this, we have to move forward. And that means building on the good exercise of the DSA enforcement, but also enriching this with more. That's why we will be working on the democracy shield that will have to kind of work on a couple of more aspects. The one is that the threat landscape, when it comes to disinformation, organized, manipulated systems, that is evolving. We see that from one election to the other, that it's an evolving threat landscape. And we have to be very much on alert of that. And very often these are hybrid threat contexts, where cyber and online disinformation waves merge. So it's also a coordination needed that goes beyond our platform regulatory kind of ecosystem, beyond that. So here, I think one of the issues that we will be discussing in the context of the democracy shield, and that's very much also in support of the member states who also see that this is a need, is to really strengthen that situational awareness. And the other is, if you want to do this in a whole society approach, to work better on the recipients of disinformation. So that calls for, first of all, strengthening media. Luckily, we have in Europe also adopted the European Media Freedom Act that will become applicable in August, and that will give a very strong boost for critical media to be also protected, the principles to be respected everywhere in the EU. But we also have to work on the citizens, because we have to make sure there is media literacy everywhere. It varies in the EU. There are member states where the population is simply better shielded. And there are member states where I think we need to catch up a little bit. So this is the whole society approach if you really want to address disinformation in a meaningful way. Yes, the accountability of platforms and putting kind of all the rules under the DSA really to kind of application is one side of the coin. But there's also the evolving landscape of threats, and there is the citizens that we need to bring into this game as well.
Very strong statement. Thank you so much, Renate. It's good to hear this voice from the Commission. I'd like to go back to Marietje and to Alexandra for comments on this, but I don't have immediately time. I want to give space first to the other panelists who haven't spoken yet. I want to go to the UK, actually, where Onwurah is a member of parliament, and also she's heading the Select Committee on Technology and Innovation and Science, which amongst other many things is going to be looking or is looking at, for example, the role of platforms in the July riots in the UK last year. So the UK has a somewhat different approach to dealing with online harms, or indeed it is a law about online harms. Why don't you join the dots for us and talk about the UK approach as relative to the Commission and what's happening?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks very much. Just going to say thank you so much it's great to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me, Cristina. And you're absolutely, as the chair of the Select Committee, you're giving me a masterclass on how to chair, and it's also, it's in some ways this morning particularly was a bit sort of back to the future for me. There was a time when the Commission reports, DGs, all the European Union Parliament, that was part of my bread and butter, daily bread and butter. That hasn't been the case for a while, and I can't say that I miss the minutiae of the state aid rules, for example, but it is great to be here to talk about these critically important issues. It's great that sense of solidarity, which Barry spoke about. So, to know that we're not alone and that we are part of Europe, even if we're not part of the European Union. And it's also really important to have these discussions, because these issues, these are old issues dressed in new clothes. These are issues about power, about human rights, about the citizen, about the role of the state. And we can't come to a solution or, without talking about it. I believe that really strongly. It's a pity that Mr. Musk doesn't seem to believe that. He still hasn't replied to my committee's invitation to him to give evidence on his approach and his platform's approach to misinformation and algorithms. I mean, apart from, he did say on X that we should go over to him to explain why the UK was censoring American companies. I'm happy to go over any time. He hasn't come back and given me a formal invitation. But I did think when we were discussing, particularly when we were discussing this morning about the 5 million tech jobs versus the 30 million manufacturing jobs, what the ratio of billionaire to worker was in each of those two sectors. And that is one of the reasons why I chose this area, algorithms, as the first inquiry for the Select Committee, because I think my constituents, the people, they see billionaires as having more power over their lives than the politicians that they elect to make their lives better. And it's really important, I think it's really important that we are shown and we're seeing to be standing up for ordinary people in this fight, as it is, for freedom and for people's economic future. And so just the South, just to briefly say the Southport riots. In the summer, we had a horrific attack on little girls at a Taylor Swift dance class in Southport, and 3 little girls were stabbed to death, many more were injured. We were in shock as a country. How could anybody do that? And within hours, there was circulating on social media, trending on X, that it was a Muslim asylum seeker who had committed these acts, and their name was and it's important to say it was trending, because when something is trending, you are getting it whether you choose to follow it or not. You are getting that name. And then very quickly after that, there were riots in a number of cities across the country. Asylum seekers, homes where asylum seekers were housed, were subject to fire bombing. A police station in Sunderland, very close to my constituency, was attacked. The police were attacked. There were, businesses and people feared for their lives. And after those riots, there was a real desire to clear up, and that, literally to clean the streets of the broken glass, but also, and this is where it's harder, to clear up what had happened and why, because just to say it was not a Muslim asylum seeker, not that that is really matters, but it wasn't a Muslim asylum seeker who had committed the attack. But there was a real desire, how had this happened? How can we make sure this does not happen again? How had this misinformation spread so quickly and so virulently, that across our country, from Newcastle to Southport, there were organized demonstrations and there were riots and attacks, and as part of that, the inquiry, it's becoming clear, and this is, it's becoming clear that the issues, we're looking at the issues of how the algorithms work, how quickly misinformation or information is spread, and what is the relationship between the individual. And I think it's really interesting, Frank, and I looked it up, the individual and how that information gets sent out and then copied from and taken away from one platform to another. And we're also, we're looking at freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is incredibly important, and there are some tensions. There, but the business model of the platforms means that there is an incentive, there is a reward for lying, and there is no downside for not lying. There's no upside rather for not lying. There's no reward for telling the truth. That's the key aspect of the business model, where advertising, targeted advertising, drives revenue. And so we're looking at the business models, we're looking at the algorithms. We are taking evidence from, not from Elon Musk at the moment, but hopefully he will get back to me. And anyone in the audience actually has a line to him, please just let him know, that, it's good to talk. And we're very happy, we're very keen to listen to him. But we in the UK, we have the Online Safety Act, which has some similar principles to in the European Union legislation, which is coming into force now. And basically, platforms have to say how they would, illegal content has to be taken down, and children have to be protected. And then platforms have to say how they would address harmful content, particularly for children. And then Ofcom will look at how they're doing that and try and decide if they're meeting their own guidelines, and has the power to fine them if they're not. And it's not clear to us whether that would have stopped the riots that we saw. And we really want to come out with recommendations which can help address this and stop this from happening in the future. And competition, this conversation this morning is clearly also a part of that, the lack of effective competition. I'll just also say briefly, Cristina, that DeepSeek, which is, I think, and I agree with President Trump on this, DeepSeek is a wake-up call for the platforms and for the tech sector. And it may be used to try and say that there should be less competition because China is coming for our sort of tech lunch. But we have to make it the fact that we, and I think as was said in the previous panel, we need to have competition in our tech sector if we are to compete globally with China and with other tech countries. We need competition. And finally, I should probably make a confession, which is that before coming into Parliament, it's not a confession that I'm a chartered electrical engineer. That's a good thing, I think. But I did work for a regulator, Ofcom, for 6 years when the internet was sort of, beginning to grow. This was 2004 to 2010. And we were so scared of stifling innovation that we refused to regulate the internet. And I'd say that, we got innovation, but we also got monopoly. And we mustn't make the same mistake with AI and with the algorithms. I think the argument for effective regulation that reflects free speech and which also drives competition and protects our citizens, because most importantly, again, our citizens have to know that government is standing up for them, whoever is trying or looking to harm them.
Thank you so much. Lots of great points. I want to go, however, before it's too late, to Guy. Guy is an academic at University of Chicago, also a publisher and a newspaper publisher. Guy, you've been very close to the Brandisian movement in all of these last few years, so you had pretty much a front seat to the work that has been done to try and tame the power of the platforms. What is your view of what's been achieved, even though in a short space of 4 years? Let's be fair, not much can be done in 4 years.
Yeah, first of all, I want to prove to Alexandra that not all men are endorse the absolute free speech version of Elon. Okay, and some men really oppose it. Let's see. We spent the better part of this morning discussion talking about economic policy and antitrust policy, and this is what we've been doing at the Stigler Center conference in the last 7 years. We started this conference in 2017, Luigi Zingales and myself, because we were worried about concentration of power in America, and a couple of years later, it was evident that we are going to talk much about big tech. But, when we talk about economic policy in this conference and in the Chicago conference, at the end of the day, we make an assumption that the framework, the foundation, is that we have liberal democracy. And this is no longer the case. This is where we are today. Democracy is backsliding all over the world. It's now 20 years, but in the last 10 years, it's at a much faster pace. I live in Chicago, and most of my family live in Israel. And every day that I wake up, I ask myself, where is democracy sliding faster, the US and Israel? And I never know the answer. This is what's happening, and we need to ask ourselves, why is this the case? So this is where our panel discussion, the title comes into play. I want to start with algorithmic amplification. Algorithmic amplification, and it's amazing to see that many people still don't get it, is the water that we all are swimming in now for a decade. And like the fish, we rarely stop to question the nature of these waters. And we should, because these algorithms have reshaped the very fabric of our society, influencing what we see, what we hear, and how we think. And if we do not confront the role of those algorithms in shaping our public discourse, the last 50 or 60 years of liberal democracy may become a distant memory. And Cristina mentioned that before I joined academia, University of Chicago, I was a journalist for many years. I founded financial newspaper, as a journalist, I'm witnessing in the last 10 years firsthand how social media erode the very fabric of our public square and basically making politicians and powerful business entities totally accountable for the public. Just to give you some data, a lot of people are still appalled by the fact that anywhere between 30 to 40% of the American people believe that the election of 2020 was stolen, although there is zero evidence for that. And the question is, how come, okay? Because even Fox News, after they had to pay $850 million, had to stop saying it. And the answer, I know that there is no traditional news media that keep saying this lie. So let me give you another data. In Israel, 30 to 40% of the Israelis today believe that the head of the Israeli military conspired with Hamas for October 7th. Yes, this is numbers from last week, from 2 or 3 weeks ago. Now, none of the traditional news media in Israel will ever say something like that or even remotely like this, okay? Where can you pick up this conspiracy? Of course, social media and one of the propaganda machines of Netanyahu. I would argue that the only reason that Netanyahu is still in power today, after October 7th, is because he is the most able user of social media propaganda in the country, and probably one of the most able users all over the world. And of course, who is enjoying this conspiracy that the army conspired with the Hamas? Of course, Netanyahu is the main benefactor. So platform power, in the past, up until a year ago, when people asked me about platform power, I had to give them a speech of 5 to 10 minutes. Today, we just need to say 2 words, Elon Musk. Think about everything. You know, I'm interested in researching media with some of the people here. We've been talking about the power of media moguls for many years. Now they all look like midgets, like gnomes, compared to what the people who control social media. And of course, Elon invokes what he called absolute free speech. Of course, I'm not I'm not a legal expert, so I'll be very careful with my discussion of free speech. And I would say is, the truth is, Jacob, that it's not that free speech isn't an important democratic value. Of course, it serves multiple essential purposes. The pursuit of truth, the formation of opinions, and the public's right to know. But in the age of social media, especially after the algorithm, the way they tweaked in the last 10 years, even though everyone has technically have freedom of expression, it is no longer fulfills any of those democratic purposes. Anyone can voice their opinion, but in practice, those voices are always drowned in the overwhelming noise of the digital landscape. And we know what, there is tons of research on it, we know what kind of opinions gains traction on social media, and how do they prioritize the content. The economic model prioritizes extreme polarizing content, and whatever gets engagement. I want to end with an agenda, okay? Cristina mentioned the neo-Brandeisian movement. You know, we've been focused most of the time in the last 5 to 7 years on consolidation of power and mergers and antitrust and Chicago School and Harvard School and all that. But what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is that this entire discussion assumes that we have a democracy, and now social media is undermining the very foundation. So what is it that I think that the agenda for people who are concerned about democracy? So number one, we should reinterpret Section 230. Only platforms that go back to the algorithm that we had 10 years ago, chronological, dump pipe, a kind of feed, should get any kind of protection. If you have an algorithm that is based on surveillance, no Section 230 for you. Number two, we should consider banning altogether targeting that is based on surveillance from a certain size of platform. Think about it. If you reach 100 million people a day or 1 billion people a day, and you're able to target them by tracking their surveillance, you are no longer, you're not a media, you are not a platform, you are the biggest political force in the world. And this is the case, and we see what's happening now with Elon in Europe. Number 3, no fake accounts, no coordinated inauthentic behavior networks that can influence countries and undermine countries all over the world, no unidentified bots, no China, Iran, Russia interfering all over the world because in elections and in societies, because this is free speech. No, bots should not have any free speech rights. Number 4, and we already mentioned it today, someone there, just to that. Number 4 is for small countries, super important, but also for not so small countries. We should regain our sovereignty, which means no high barriers as we have today all over the world for people or countries that want to sue big tech when they leave wreckage and disarray and instability in society all over the world. And number 5, of course, is obvious, and the reason we're still waiting for it in 2025 is beyond my understanding, is of course age gating. Okay, we don't let our kids use drugs, drink, and drive when they are 12. Social media is probably more dangerous and more addictive than most of the drugs and addiction known to men. So this is, I think, the agenda where we start to explore and to think about how do we advance these ideas and causes. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you, Guy. Great points. I wish I could go around once more, but I do want to give Dovev the opportunity to set out his piece. Now, this is a little bit left of center, but I think we've spoken about regulation, the effectiveness of regulation, what we can do. It doesn't mean that because we have existing regulation, we have to stop thinking about new approaches, new ideas. So it is welcome that academics spend time thinking about what can be done as an additional incremental approach to these things. And Dovev has a paper which is just coming out together with Tommaso Valletti that I think should be a recommendation to all of us about how to think about business models and incentives, particularly how we should just privilege certain approaches to pushing competition. Do you want to give the nub of the paper, because we don't have time for an academic presentation, huh? No way.
Thank you very much, Cristina. The good news is that I'm the last speaker. But the bad news is that this perfect storm is still here, and we have dominant digital platforms colliding with national politics, and Europe has been relying mostly on regulation, but regulation has its limits. The question is what can be done to withstand this big tech and upstart Chinese platforms, and what can we do to encourage European digital platforms that better serve society? So I would like to abandon for a moment the traditional toolkit that we are using and propose a different approach, which is voluntary certification of digital platforms. And the idea is that this approach can perhaps restrain some of the harms caused by dominant platforms, but more importantly, it can motivate a new generation of emerging platforms that have business models that are more stakeholder-oriented. So we would not expect the big tech firms to rush and certify their platforms to change their exploitative practices, but to the extent that we can provide some rewards to small emerging platforms that align their practices with the interests of stakeholders and society, this can be very useful. Some of these small platforms include Mastodon, Brightly, 3Market, Proton, Signal, many that very few of us are familiar with. But let me go back in time. 30 years ago, before pursuing my PhD at the Wharton School, I was a consultant for companies undergoing the ISO 9000 certification. And I had to convince executives that this seal of approval will allow them to attract consumers and build their businesses, and this will pay off. Today, we have more than 1 million certified sites, and ISO 9000 is needed to play. And this is because the early adopters gain a differentiation advantage, the same advantage that these emergent platforms can gain today. So by complementing protective regulation with a system that verifies the claims of digital platforms concerning their stakeholder orientation and their good deeds, we might be able to allow those contender platforms to gain enough market share to force some of the big tech firms to respond by revisiting their practices and perhaps in an effort to retain or regain market share. So briefly, what is this certification? The idea is that you will have an external independent third party using scorecards to assess the desirable and also the undesirable practices of digital platforms. And this system would give us some validation of the practices. Now, clearly, the digital platforms would try to misrepresent their practices, to disguise them, to maintain secrecy in order to avoid being caught violating regulations. This is why we need to go beyond the practices themselves and examine also the algorithms. The algorithms would reveal the true nature of these practices, the inner working, and by examining them, we'll be able to enhance transparency and avoid the misinformation. For this, we need a body that will be able to examine this, and this requires an interdisciplinary unit with expertise not only in business administration, legal affairs, but also computer science. You might be wondering why would the platforms cooperate with such an investigation? They might be concerned about their intellectual property, but the issue is that the DMA and DSA already outline circumstances under which they should expose their data and algorithms. The certification will make this a default in every inspection as opposed to a rare event that is unlikely to happen because of self-assessment. So we need to create this unit, but to gain legitimacy, we better rely on existing certifying bodies like ISO or the B-Lab that already have the resources, the expertise, the processes. They would just need to adjust their scorecards to the content and the context of digital platforms. So we don't expect the big tech companies to rush and certify. In fact, as long as they can gain more from their harmful practices than the differentiation advantage of certification net the cost of readjustment, they are unlikely to do that. But if these contender platforms are able to draw more customers, hire better employees, grow their business and gain some market share, then they will be able to impose this competitive pressure that might be able to convince some big tech companies to revisit their practices. And if not, then regulators might make this voluntary certification mandatory for those platforms. So the adoption of the certification depends not only on the regulator, but also on the differentiation value of this standard. It depends on network externalities, competitive pressure. And eventually, I think that we might be able to nurture a new generation of small tech companies that would pursue more favorable practices, those that are aligned with the social interest, and I can discuss this further later.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you short, but we are running late. And I know that there is another panel. I want you to know that when I discussed the idea with Dovev initially, I gave him a very hard time. I said, come off it. What's going to happen? Who is going to do this? But he has answers, and him and Tommaso thought about to come back. So I would not dismiss this idea as just academic nirvana. There is some substance to it. So we are several minutes late already. I do not have time to go around the group again. Does anyone have any burning issue they want to say? Otherwise, again, I can see people saying no. I can release everyone from this panel. And again, oh, Frank, sorry, I wasn't. Do you want to say something, Frank, in closure?
Cristina, I want to just sort of ground this all very simply and just give you a hypothetical story. Pretend I was the head of the Postal Service and I said to each of you, you could have your mail for free. And you say, okay, what's the deal? I said, well, I'm going to put a camera and listening device in every room of your home, in your workplace, and in your car and surveil you. You would probably say that's very creepy. I'd say, but it's for free. Then I'd say, I'm going to open your mail. I'm going to read it. Everything I learn is now mine, not yours. Not just what you like to eat or where you shop or your friends, but also your thoughts and your most intimate feelings. You'd say, whoa, that's unfair, creepy and unfair. Oh, one other thing. I'm going to read your 13-year-old daughter's diary. And when I learn that she's concerned about something, say her weight or this or that, I'm going to send her information to make her feel worse. I'm going to send her information to profit from that, and I'm going to instruct her how to hurt or harm herself. You'd say, wait a second, creepy, unfair, and downright harmful. That's the internet we have, and I appreciate the regulatory approach, but why on earth are we letting these platforms have all this information to start with? As Marietje said, we're dependent on the technology. Data is our personhood in the digital age. Don't we want to own ourselves? And this is the key. Europe has a huge opportunity. Because big tech doesn't live in Europe, you can create a rights-respecting tech paradigm that changes how this tech works, prioritizing individuals, returning agency to individuals, and having the tech be harmonized with our democratic ideals and principles.
One second. Thank you so much, Frank. That was a great way to end. Guy, what?
One short sentence to continue the dystopian story of Frank here. Now imagine that you have 5 companies like that, and there is a new president of the biggest country in the world, and in the sitting arrangement of his inauguration, he gets those 5 people to sit on the front row, and they all comply.
Imagine, just imagine, okay? Thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you, Frank. It was very much appreciated. Can I ask the panel is released because we go straight into the next panel. Thank you so much, everyone. Do not go anywhere.